That one time American soldiers went on a Banzai charge. Did you know that the most decorated US military unit in history was made up of children of Japanese immigrants? It may sound ironic, but the soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Battalion were composed entirely of second-generation Japanese and one Korean. They had a reputation for carrying out impossible missions and fighting in the most dangerous conditions with the odds stacked against them. But what inspired these men to fight so bravely that they earned 21 Medals of Honor, over 18,000 awards and citations, and the nickname Purple Heart Battalion?
I went to Japan.
When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, it not only provoked America to join World War II, but also sealed the fate of all the Japanese living in the United States. Almost overnight, the Japanese-American community faced widespread distrust and discrimination because of their heritage. The public feared and hated them. The government considered them a national security threat. It didn't matter if many of them had never been to Japan and couldn't speak a word of Japanese. In everyone's eyes, they were nothing but spies waiting for a chance to attack the US mainland. From suspects to soldiers, the origin of the 100th and 442nd. In February 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the War Relocation Department to evict around 120 Japanese from their homes on the West Coast and transfer them to internment camps in the middle of the desert. The relocation centers operated like concentration camps. They were completely remote and surrounded by guard towers and barbed wire. Many of the incarcerated spent the first few weeks sleeping in stables that smelled of urine and leaked when it rained. But in Hawaii, the situation was different. There was no segregation between the races, and 37% of its population was made up of ethnic Japanese. Military Governor De Los Emmons chose not to send them to relocation centers. Instead, Hawaii was placed under martial law, and only community leaders with Japanese blood were interned. He removed 1,300 ethnic Japanese reservists in the Territorial Guard, but allowed the ones in active duty to remain. After being ordered to surrender their weapons, the Nisei reservists petitioned the government for a chance to serve in the army. Regardless of what everyone believed, they were loyal to the United States and wanted to defend their country from its attackers. The governor agreed to accept them back, but not as soldiers. He put them in a new construction unit called the Varsity Victory Volunteers and gave them menial tasks like quarrying and digging trenches. Around the time of the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Governor De Los Emmons feared that the Nisei soldiers would cause problems if the Japanese tried to conquer Hawaii. To protect Hawaii from this threat, he shipped them off to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, where they formed the 100th Infantry Battalion, or the 1 Puka Puka. Although they were already well-trained soldiers, they were put through basic training all over again. 8 months later, they transferred to Camp Shelby, Mississippi for advanced training. At last, the time came to send the 100th to the front line. More volunteers were recruited among the Nisei in the concentration camps, but only about 1,000 signed up. In contrast, in Hawaii, where they were treated better, 10,000 Nisei volunteered. 4,000 were selected to form the 442nd Regimental Combat Team on February 1st, 1943. From Salerno to Cassino, the 100th make waves in Italy. On September 2, 1943, the 100th Battalion arrived in North Africa. 20 days later, they landed in Salerno, Italy, and were attached to the 34th Infantry Division under General Mark Clark. The amphibious assault at Salerno Gulf was something like the Normandy landings on D-Day, but with fewer troops and less equipment involved. The goal was to drive out the Germans and fascists from Italy, liberate the capital, and move northward until they reached the German border. Now, the 100th found themselves in a unique situation. Not only were they treated with discrimination for their ethnic background, they also looked exactly like the enemy. Lieutenant General Mark Clark called them the guinea pigs from Hawaii. One of them was Korean-American Young Oak Kim. Across the Pacific, Japan had invaded Korea and raped, massacred, and brutalized its citizens. Their commander offered to transfer him to another unit for his own peace of mind, but he refused, saying, "There are no Japanese nor Koreans here. We're all Americans, and we're fighting for the same cause." But whether or not they would be treated like Americans was a different story. From Salerno, they began to drive north. The Germans retreated toward the Winter Line, which was made up of 3 successive defensive lines that stretched across Italy. The strongest of these was the heavily heavily fortified Gustav Line. It passed through the town of Cassino, which was flanked by mountains and the Rapido River. Behind the town was Highway 7, the only available road which led to Rome. So, fresh from their victories, the 100th marched toward Cassino with no idea just what sort of hell awaited them in the town. A monastery in the mountains. The trial by fire at the Gustav Line. Trying to break through the Gustav Line at Cassino turned out to be next to impossible. The Germans had excellent fortifications and used the mountainous terrain to their advantage. Equipment and weapons were being reserved from the planned landings at Normandy, so the US Army in Italy had limited resources. The 100th Battalion was put at the forefront of the attack, facing mines, mortars, and machine guns that decimated their ranks. As the weeks drew on, they had to call for replacements from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, who were still training at Camp Shelby. What made the battle extra difficult were the hills above the town, from where the enemy had a clear view of anyone trying to climb up. Each time the 100th tried to attack, the Germans easily cut them down. The Americans blamed the monastery on top of a hill named Monte Cassino. They thought the Germans were using it as a lookout point. Despite being a protected heritage site, General Clark requested for planes to bomb the monastery, killing 230 civilians sheltering inside, but not hitting the German positions in the mountain. Unfortunately, this only made things worse. The Germans were under orders to leave the monastery alone, and when it had been reduced to rubble, they quickly moved in and attacked the Americans with even better accuracy. The casualty count got so high that nearly the entire 1st Battalion of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was depleted to replace the original members of the 100th. Finally, they were forced to pull out. Having failed to capture the town, the 100th were sent to the port of Anzio, which was north of the Gustav Line and closer to Rome. This time, their job was to create a diversion to draw some of the Germans away from the Gustav Line, so the other Allied armies could achieve a breakthrough at Cassino. Then they were to slowly but surely attack and destroy the remaining German forces in the Winter Line. However, General Clark had another idea. Instead of sticking to the plan to kill off the enemy while he had the chance, he sent his men to liberate Rome. As they neared the capital, the men of the 100th were ordered to stop marching and rest by the roadside. They waited, wondering what was going on. Then, a short while later, the other American units began parading into the city, leaving the 100th sitting in the dust. Apparently, the commanders couldn't let persons of color be the first Americans in Rome, especially not soldiers who looked just like the enemy wreaking havoc one ocean away. It was like a slap in the face. The 100th had been nicknamed the Purple Heart Battalion because 900 of them were either killed or wounded in the battles of Monte Cassino and Anzio, but in spite of all their sacrifices, they still didn't get treated the way they deserved. Next time, they decided they would have to score a decisive victory against the enemy to truly earn the army's respect. Go for broke, the rescue of the Lost Battalion. In June 1944, just as the Allied forces in the north launched an attack on the beaches of France, the 100th Battalion linked up with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Italy. It took the place of the regiment's 1st Battalion, but because of its incomparable track record, the 100th was allowed to keep its name. The new ones were eager to prove themselves in battle. The veterans were prepared to continue the fight to the bitter end. They continued liberating town after town in Italy and eastern France. But the mission they were most famous for was the rescue of the Lost Battalion in the Vosges Mountains near the French-German border. This time they were attached to the 36th Infantry Division under the commander of General John Dahlquist. Like General Clark, General Dahlquist was an ambitious commander who made mistakes in his rush to score victories against Germany. He kept pushing his exhausted men closer and closer towards the border without factoring in the cost in human lives. He pushed the 141st Regiment so far ahead that on October 24th, its 1st Battalion advanced through the hills into enemy lines, miles away from friendly support. This turned out to be a trap. They found themselves encircled by 6,000 German soldiers, with no way to break through and nowhere to retreat. Rescuing the Lost Battalion was going to be a suicide mission. After 2 failed attempts by the other 2 battalions of the 141st, General Dahlquist couldn't afford to lose any more white Americans just to fix his tactical mistake. Guess who he called in next? If you guessed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, you'd be correct. The Nisei had just come back from liberating the towns of Bruyères and Bifontaine. After getting only 2 days of rest after months of non-stop fighting, they were recalled to the battlefield in the middle of the night. On October 24th, they began to attack the German lines. They fought through rain, mud, snow, dense forests, and heavy gunfire for 6 days. They braved an hour-long artillery barrage along the way, and sometimes had to hold on to each other in one line to keep from getting lost in a very thick fog. The Combat Engineer Company had its hands full people, clearing obstacles and preparing the way for them to pass through the minefields and steep terrain, had to aim at the enemy while risking hitting their own troops. But it was only 6 days later, and they learned their real objective. On October 29th, they received a desperate call for help. The 211 trapped soldiers were in a situation so dire that if the rescuers came any later, they would die or have to surrender. They had no more food and medicine. Their only source of water was guarded by the Germans. Airdrop supplies rolled down the hill straight into enemy hands, and shooting them chocolates attached to artillery shells only added to their casualties. The only way to reach the lost battalion was through a narrow ridge. It was guarded by Germans on both sides, who pounded the Nisai with relentless fire from their bunkers. If they dared to move forward, German machine guns would rip them to pieces. The Nisai couldn't even poke their heads out of their foxholes without getting shot, but if they delayed any longer, the lost battalion would surely be captured. It was in this moment of crisis that the 442nd remembered their motto, "Go for broke," meaning to risk everything to achieve the goal. A group of men from the 3rd Battalion glanced at each other and made the decision. Simultaneously, they rose out of their foxholes and started charging up the ridge with grenades and bayonets. The others quickly followed behind, yelling "Banzai" as bullets and mortar shells exploded all around them. Those who survived made it up the hill, drove the Germans away, and finally made contact with the lost battalion. Together, they fought for another week until they secured the forest, but the cost was heavy. The Nisai suffered 800 casualties during their daring rescue. On November 12th, General Dahlquist ordered the Nisai to assemble for an awarding ceremony. What he saw before him was only the size of one platoon. All companies had less than 35 men present. K Company had 18. I Company had 8. Thinking the regiment's commander had disobeyed orders, the general got mad and demanded to know where the rest of the men were. To his complete shock, the commander informed him that everyone else was either dead or in the hospital. One last hurrah, breaking the Gothic line. The remaining Nisai finally got 4 months of hard-earned rest, guarding the border of France. Their next assignment was to assault the Gothic line in March 1945. It was north of the Gustav Line where the 100th Battalion had fought over a year ago, but this time, they had fully earned the respect of their superiors. No less than 3 generals, including Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, wanted their assistance. General Clark of the 34th Division, who had earlier called them guinea pigs from Hawaii, even had to negotiate to get them back. The Gothic line stretched from a mountain range in the east to a river valley in the west. The Nisai split up into 3 battalions, each with different targets. They moved into position in complete silence under the cover of darkness. At dawn, they attacked, taking the Germans by surprise. 2 of their objectives, Georgia Hill and Mount Fulgarito, fell in less than 30 minutes. The Gothic line, which had held strong for months, finally cracked open. If anyone still doubted the Nisai's combat abilities, this was solid proof just how capable they were. After the Gothic line fell a month later, the Nisai liberated the concentration camp of Dachau and joined the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division as they attacked Hitler's Eagle's Nest. Over 14,000 Nisai served in the U.S. Army during World War II. They took part in 5 major campaigns in Europe. 2/3 died in battle, but only one of the 21 Medals of Honor was awarded right after the war. It belonged to Sadao Monomori, who threw himself on a grenade that was rolling towards his foxhole. He saved the lives of 2 of his squad mates, but lost his own. It took decades for most of the accolades to come pouring in. Yet, through their sacrifices, they had already achieved what they had set out to do. No one could ever question their loyalty to their country ever again. They proved themselves as brave and capable as the greatest soldiers America sent to the front lines of the greatest war.